April 18, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm over Tokyo, a city that had never known the terror of bombs falling from hostile skies. The Japanese Empire, still flush with the intoxicating victories of Pearl Harbor and Manila, believed themselves invulnerable behind thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. But on that spring morning, 16 American B-105 Mitchell bombers roared over the sacred homeland, shattering not just windows and walls, but an entire nation's sense of invincibility. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood on the pitching deck of the USS Hornet, watching his crews prepare for what many considered a suicide mission. The plan seemed impossible from its inception. Launch fully loaded Army bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier, strike the Japanese mainland, then somehow reach friendly Chinese territory 1,200 miles beyond. No B-25 had ever taken off from a carrier before. The runway available measured only 467 feet, less than half what the bombers normally required. The audacious scheme originated in the dark months following Pearl Harbor, when American morale had plummeted to depths not seen since the Civil War. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt demanded action. Some bold stroke to prove America could strike back. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's comprehensive work, "At dawn we slept." The president personally pressed his military commanders for options. Any options that would take the fight to Japan's doorstep. Captain Francis Stewart Lowe of the Navy's Submarine Warfare Division conceived the initial concept while watching bombers practice to Chongo landings at Norfolk Naval Station. What if, he wondered, Army bombers could launch from a carrier? He brought the idea to Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations, who immediately saw its psychological potential. King summoned Doolittle, a legendary aviator who had won the Congressional Medal of Honor and set numerous speed records. "I need someone who understands the impossible," King reportedly told him. Doolittle handpicked his volunteers from the 17th Bombardment Group, never revealing their true target. The men trained relentlessly at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing short takeoffs until they could lift their bombers skyward in distances that defied aeronautical wisdom. They stripped every ounce of unnecessary weight from their aircraft, removing even the bottom gun turrets. Special fuel tanks were installed, extending their range but making every plane a flying bomb vulnerable to a single spark. The task force departed from San Francisco on April 2, 1942. To carriers Hornet and Enterprise, along with 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 fleet oilers, formed Task Force 16 under Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr. Security remained absolute. Even most of the sailors aboard didn't know their mission until Halsey broke radio silence mid-voyage to announce, "This force is bound for Tokyo." The original plan called for launching 450 miles from Japan, giving the bombers enough fuel to reach Chinese airfields after the attack. But early on the morning of April 18th, a Japanese picket boat spotted the American fleet 650 miles offshore. Though the boat was quickly sunk by the cruiser Nashville, the element of surprise had been compromised. Doolittle faced an agonizing choice: abort the mission or launch immediately. Knowing his crews would run desperately short of fuel, he chose to launch. The sea swells rose 20 feet that morning, sending spray cascading across Hornet's flight deck. Lieutenant Henry Miller, the naval officer responsible for the launch, watched the carrier's bow rise and plunge with nauseating regularity. Timing would be everything. Each pilot would need to release his brakes precisely as the bow reached its highest point, gaining crucial extra lift from the upward momentum. Doolittle insisted on leading the first bomber off the deck. At 7:25 in the morning, his Mitchell, dubbed No. 1, sat positioned with its nose wheel barely touching the white line marking the absolute forward limit of the deck. Behind him stretched 467 feet of wooden planking, then nothing but churning ocean. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Eugene Cole, later recalled in interviews preserved by the National Museum of the United States Air Force that the tension in the cockpit felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Lieutenant Miller raised his checkered flag, circling it rapidly. Doolittle pushed his throttles to full power. The twin Wright Cyclone engines screamed, and the bomber strained against its wheel chocks like a leashed beast. Miller watched the bow, waited for the perfect moment as the carrier rose on a swell, then slashed his flag downward.
Ow.
Doolittle released the brakes. The heavily laden bomber lumbered forward, gaining speed agonizingly slowly. Sailors lining the deck held their breath. The plane reached the end of the flight deck and dropped from view as it cleared the bow. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed destined to plunge into the sea. Then Doolittle coaxed it upward, the bomber clawing for altitude mere feet above the whitecaps. A tremendous cheer erupted from the Hornet's crew. One by one, 15 more bombers followed. Each launch was a calculated dance with death. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy, pilot of aircraft number 6, later described the experience as like being shot from a cannon. The deck crew worked with practiced precision, positioning each bomber exactly on the line, checking wheel chocks, and coordinating with Miller's flag signals. The entire launch sequence took barely an hour. Not every takeoff went smoothly. One bomber's nose wheel slipped off the wet deck markings, forcing the crew to reposition while precious fuel burned. Another pilot released his brakes slightly early, causing his plane to drift left toward the carrier's island superstructure. Quick work by the deck crew prevented disaster. But all 16 bombers ultimately got airborne, a feat that veteran Navy pilots watching from Enterprise's deck considered miraculous. The bombers formed up loosely and turned west toward Japan, flying so low their propellers nearly touched the wave tops. This altitude kept them below Japanese radar coverage, which had been developed with Soviet high-altitude bombers in mind. The crews settled in for the 5-hour flight, each man alone with his thoughts about what awaited them. Flying alongside Doolittle, Lieutenant Travis Hoover piloted aircraft number 2. Its navigator, Lieutenant Carl Richard Wildner, kept meticulous records of their course, knowing they would need every calculation perfect for the return journey to China. Behind them, 15 other crews did the same, each bomber separated by miles to avoid presenting a coordinated target. The weather cooperated initially, with low clouds providing additional cover. But as they approached the Japanese coast, the skies cleared treacherously. At one point, Doolittle's crew spotted a Japanese patrol boat and deliberately altered course to avoid it, then returned to their heading once safely past. Every minute brought them closer to the point of no return, the moment when their fuel state made retreat impossible. Around noon, the first bombardiers caught sight of the Japanese coastline rising from the sea. Lieutenant William Farrow, piloting aircraft number 16, radioed a terse message. Land ho. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The citizens of Tokyo spent that April afternoon absorbed in ordinary pursuits, completely unprepared for the impossible. Factory workers assembled weapons destined for the China front. School children practiced their calligraphy lessons. In the Imperial Palace, officials conducted routine business. The war, they believed, remained safely distant, fought in China and across the vast Pacific. Japanese air raid drills were considered perfunctory exercises, training for an invasion that could never come. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, Doolittle's bomber crossed the Japanese coastline near the city of Inubosaki, flying at rooftop level. The Mitchell bomber presented such an unexpected sight that witnesses initially mistook it for one of their own aircraft experiencing mechanical difficulties. Some even waved. The bomber crew navigated using landmarks and a simple map torn from a National Geographic magazine, following railway lines that led directly to the capital. Captain Edward York, piloting aircraft number 8, approached from a different angle. His bombardier Lieutenant Nolan Herndon hunched over the Norden bomb site that represented America's most guarded technological secret. The targets had been carefully selected: aircraft factories, oil storage facilities, military arsenals, and power plants. Doolittle had issued strict orders forbidding attacks on the Imperial Palace or civilian residential areas, understanding that war crimes would only strengthen Japanese resolve. The air raid sirens remained silent as the first bombs fell. Doolittle's plane released its payload on a factory complex in northern Tokyo at exactly 12:36. 500-pound bombs tumbled earthward, their delayed fuses allowing the bomber to escape the blast radius. Seconds later, explosions rippled through the industrial district. Black smoke boiled skyward, visible for miles. Chaos erupted across the city. Lieutenant Robert Gray's bomber struck targets in the central district, bombs igniting a fuel depot that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. Lieutenant Richard Joyce attacked the Japan Special Steel Company plant, his explosives destroying machinery that had been producing critical engine parts for Zero fighters. Each bomber carried 4 bombs, and each crew made their ordnance count. Japanese defenses, caught completely unprepared, responded with confused fury. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but their shells burst far above the low-flying American bombers. Fighter pilots scrambled to their aircraft, only to find the attackers had already disappeared into the distance by the time they got airborne. According to records preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, Radio communications dissolved into pandemonium as military commanders struggled to understand how American bombers could possibly be attacking the homeland. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's aircraft struck targets in eastern Tokyo before turning toward the coast. His tail gunner, Sergeant Donald Fitzmaurice, watched Japanese fighters finally appear in pursuit, their pilots clearly enraged but unable to catch the American bombers accelerating at full throttle. 1-0 came within firing range, its machine guns spitting tracers. But Fitzmaurice returned fire, and the Japanese pilot broke off, unwilling to follow the Americans out to sea. Beyond Tokyo, other bombers struck Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. Lieutenant William Bauer attacked an aircraft factory in Yokohama, his Bombardier Staff Sergeant Waldo Bither achieving direct hits on the main assembly building. In Nagoya, Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's crew targeted the Matsushigaya Army Arsenal, their bombs detonating ammunition stores and creating secondary explosions that continued for hours. The entire raid lasted less than 30 minutes from first bomb to last. 16 bombers dropped their ordnance and vanished eastward toward the ocean, leaving behind fires, casualties, and a nation stunned into disbelief. Physical damage, while significant, was less important than the psychological impact. Japan's military leadership had promised absolute protection of the homeland. That promise now lay shattered in smoking ruins. As the last bomber cleared Japanese airspace, the true ordeal began. Doolittle's crews faced 1,200 miles of open ocean followed by Japanese-occupied Chinese territory before reaching friendly forces. The early launch, necessitated by the picket boat encounter, meant every aircraft was critically short of fuel. They had enough to reach the Chinese coast, but nothing more. Night landings at unfamiliar airfields were impossible in 1942, when electronic navigation aids existed only in laboratories. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, piloting aircraft number 7, dubbed Ruptured Duck, monitored his fuel gauges with growing alarm. The math was inexorable. They would run dry somewhere over China. His crew began preparing for a crash landing, stowing loose equipment and reviewing emergency procedures. Beside him, co-pilot Lieutenant Dean Davenport maintained radio silence, knowing that any transmission might betray their position to Japanese forces. The weather deteriorated as afternoon became evening. Storm clouds gathered over the East China Sea, and soon the bombers were flying through driving rain that reduced visibility to near zero. Lieutenant Hoover, who had maintained position near Doolittle's aircraft throughout the raid, lost sight of his commander in the murk. Each bomber was now completely alone. Doolittle reached the Chinese coast near the city of Ningbo as darkness fell. His fuel gauges read empty. The engines continued running only because the fuel lines still held residual gasoline. The weather made visual navigation impossible, and the Chinese airfields they had been promised remained invisible below the storm. At approximately 9 in the evening, with his engines beginning to sputter, Doolittle made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered his crew to bail out. One by one, the 5 men jumped into the black Chinese night. Doolittle went last, watching his faithful bomber disappear into the darkness after carrying them more than 2,000 miles from the Hornet's deck. He landed hard in a rice paddy, knee-deep in mud and completely disoriented. The thunderstorm raged around him as he gathered his parachute and tried to determine where he was. He later admitted to believing the mission had been a complete failure and expected to face court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft. 13 other bombers faced similar fates. Lieutenant Harold Watson's crew bailed out near the town of Linhai. Lieutenant Robert Gray's men jumped into the mountains of Zhejiang province. Some crews landed in areas controlled by Chinese nationalist forces, who provided immediate assistance. Others came down in Japanese-occupied territory, beginning desperate games of cat and mouse with enemy patrols. Lieutenant Lawson attempted to ditch Ruptured Duck along the Chinese coast, hoping to save his aircraft. The crash landing went catastrophically wrong. The bomber hit a submerged reef at over 100 miles per hour, disintegrating on impact. Lawson was thrown through the windscreen, his leg nearly severed. Corporal David Thatcher, the crew's engineer and gunner, though injured himself, dragged the wounded to shore and provided first aid that saved lives. Chinese fishermen eventually found the survivors and transported them to medical care. 2 crews never made it to friendly territory. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's bomber ran out of fuel over the ocean near the Chinese coast. Attempting to ditch in the surf, the aircraft broke apart. The crew survived but were immediately captured by Japanese forces. Lieutenant William Farrow's crew, flying the last bomber in the formation, similarly ran out of fuel and crash-landed in Japanese-controlled territory. Both crews became prisoners, facing a fate far worse than death in combat. One bomber took a different path entirely. Captain Edward York, confronting fuel exhaustion before reaching China, made the controversial decision to divert north toward the Soviet Union. The Soviets, technically neutral in the Pacific War, interned York and his crew for over a year. While this decision saved their lives, it sparked debate about whether York had violated his orders by seeking neutral refuge. News of the raid reached American shores within days, though military censors initially suppressed details about the carrier launch to protect future operations. President Roosevelt, when asked at a press conference where the bombers had come from, it smiled mysteriously and replied, "Shangri-La," referencing the mythical Himalayan paradise from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. The name stuck. Americans hungry for good news embraced the story of Doolittle's daring raid. In Japan, the reaction was profoundly different. The military leadership, particularly within the Imperial Japanese Navy, recognized immediately that the raid represented a catastrophic intelligence and strategic failure. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood the implications with chilling clarity. If American carriers could approach close enough to launch bombers against Tokyo, they could do so again. The home islands were vulnerable. According to historical accounts preserved in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war, the raid triggered several major Japanese strategic decisions. Most significantly, Yamamoto accelerated plans for the Midway operation, an ambitious offensive intended to draw out and destroy the American carrier fleet. Japanese naval planners believed that eliminating American carriers would end the threat of future raids. This decision, made partly in response to Doolittle's attack, would lead directly to Japan's devastating defeat at the Battle of Midway 6 weeks later. The Chinese people, who aided the American airmen, paid a terrible price. Japanese forces, enraged by China's assistance to the raiders, launched what became known as the Zhejiang Sea Campaign. 250,000 Japanese troops swept through the provinces where the Americans had landed, systematically destroying villages, poisoning wells, and massacring civilians. Historical estimates suggest that as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians died in retaliation for helping the Doolittle crews. Entire communities were obliterated as punishment for their compassion. The 8 captured airmen faced Japanese military courts in what historians now recognize as sham trials. Lieutenant Hallmark, Lieutenant Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. The remaining 5 prisoners endured years of torture, starvation, and disease in Japanese captivity. Lieutenant Robert Meader died of malnutrition and dysentery in December 1943. The 4 survivors, Lieutenant George Barr, Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, Corporal Jacob DeShezer, and Sergeant William Dieter, were not freed until August 1945, when Japan surrendered. Doolittle reunited with all but 2 members of his own crew within days of bailing out. Chinese nationalist guerrillas had found them scattered across the countryside and guided them to safety. Doolittle, still believing he had failed by losing all 16 aircraft, was stunned to receive the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt and an immediate promotion from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. Skipping the rank of full colonel entirely, General Henry Arnold told him bluntly, "You have no idea what you've accomplished." The psychological impact rippled far beyond military calculations. Americans, demoralized by months of defeats and retreats, suddenly had heroes to celebrate. Recruitment offices saw a surge in volunteers. War bond sales increased dramatically. The nation's mood shifted from defensive despair to offensive determination. Japan had awakened a sleeping giant at Pearl Harbor. Doolittle's raid proved that giant was now very much awake and angry. For ordinary Japanese citizens, the raid shattered carefully constructed propaganda narratives. They had been told America was weak, decadent, and incapable of striking back. The bombs falling on Tokyo told a different story. Doubt crept into previously certain minds. If the military could not protect the capital itself, could they truly guarantee ultimate victory? The survivors of the Doolittle raid carried their experiences for the rest of their lives, marked by memories both triumphant and tragic. Doolittle himself never forgot the Chinese villagers who saved his life, hiding him from Japanese patrols and guiding him through enemy territory at tremendous risk to themselves. He returned to China after the war multiple times, searching for those who had helped him, bringing gifts and expressing gratitude that could never fully repay the debt he felt he owed. Lieutenant Ted Lawson spent 13 months in hospitals recovering from his injuries. His leg, so severely damaged in the crash of ruptured duck, had to be amputated. He eventually wrote a memoir titled 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, published in 1943, which became a bestseller and was adapted into a major motion picture starring Spencer Tracy as Doolittle and Van Johnson as Lawson. The book's proceeds helped support families of the men who never returned. Corporal David Thatcher, whose heroic actions saved Lawson and other injured crew members on that Chinese beach, rarely spoke of his role. Returned home to Montana, married, and worked for a highway maintenance company for over 30 years. Only late in life did he begin accepting invitations to speak about the raid, always deflecting praise toward the Chinese civilians whose courage, he insisted, far exceeded his own. He attended Doolittle Raider reunions faithfully until his death in 2016 at age 94. The captured raiders who survived Japanese captivity returned to America in 1945 as gaunt, traumatized shadows of the young men who had volunteered for a secret mission 3 years earlier. Lieutenant George Barr weighed less than 90 pounds when liberated from a prison camp near Beijing. The physical scars healed slowly. The psychological wounds never fully closed. Yet all 4 survivors rebuilt their lives with remarkable resilience, marrying, raising families, and seldom speaking publicly about their ordeal. Corporal Jacob DeShazer's story took an unexpected turn. While imprisoned, he received a Bible from his captors and underwent a profound religious conversion. After the war, he returned to Japan as a Christian missionary, spending 30 years helping rebuild the nation he had once bombed. His story of forgiveness and reconciliation inspired Mitsuo Fukita, the Japanese pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, to convert to Christianity himself. These 2 warriors, who had been enemies during the war's darkest days, became friends and collaborated on religious outreach for decades. The Doolittle Raiders established a tradition of annual reunions, gathering to honor their fallen comrades and remember their shared experience. They commissioned a silver goblet for each of the 80 original crew members and a bottle of cognac bottled in 1896, the year of Doolittle's birth. Their plan called for the last 2 survivors to open the bottle and toast their departed brothers. This ceremony, deeply moving in its symbolism, embodied the brotherhood forged in extraordinary circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, became the last surviving raider. He maintained the tradition of the reunions even as the numbers dwindled. November 2013, with only 4 raiders still living, they held what they knew would be their final public reunion at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Thousands attended to honor these elderly warriors who had struck the first blowback against Japan. On April 18, 2019, the 77th anniversary of the raid, Cole passed away at age 103 in Texas. With his death, the last direct link to that audacious mission disappeared, but the legacy endured. Every year, the Air Force commemorates Doolittle Raid Day. Aviation museums display artifacts from the mission. Historians continue studying its strategic and psychological impacts. The Chinese communities that suffered Japanese retaliation have not been forgotten, though their sacrifice remains less known in the West than it should be. Several organizations, including the Sino-American Aviation Heritage Foundation, work to preserve the memory of the Chinese civilians who paid such a terrible price for their humanity and courage. Memorials in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces honor the dead, ensuring that Chinese schoolchildren learn about their ancestors' sacrifice. The immediate military value of the Doolittle raid, measured in purely material terms, was modest. The physical damage inflicted on Japanese targets was quickly repaired. No critical war industry was permanently crippled. The 16 bombers represented a total loss with no replacement value. Cold cost-benefit analysis might conclude the operation was wasteful. Such analysis would miss the point entirely. Admiral Yamamoto's decision to accelerate the Midway operation, directly influenced by the raid, proved catastrophic for Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed virtually its entire carrier fleet to an elaborate operation designed to lure American carriers into a decisive battle. Japanese planners believed American naval power in the Pacific had been reduced to perhaps 2 operational carriers. They were wrong. For American carriers, including Enterprise and Hornet, which had launched Doolittle's bombers, awaited them at Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th through June 7th, 1942, became the turning point of the Pacific War. Japanese forces lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of irreplaceable experienced pilots. The combined fleet, which had seemed invincible 6 months earlier, never recovered from this defeat. American industrial capacity would eventually produce dozens of new carriers, but Japan lacked the resources to replace what was lost at Midway. Historians debate precisely how much the Doolittle raid influenced Yamamoto's thinking, but the connection is well documented. Japanese naval officers testified after the war that the need to prevent future raids against the homeland drove much of the strategic planning in spring 1942. The raid demonstrated that defensive perimeters alone could not protect Japan. Only offensive action to destroy American naval power could guarantee security. Beyond the Midway connection, the raid altered Japanese defensive deployments throughout their conquered territories. Additional fighter squadrons were recalled to defend the home islands, weakening Japanese air power in the South Pacific and China. Coastal radar stations were expanded and improved. Anti-aircraft batteries were reinforced around major cities. These defensive measures diverted resources from offensive operations, slowing Japan's expansion at a critical moment when American forces were still reeling from earlier defeats. The raid's psychological impact on Japanese strategic thinking manifested in other ways. Japanese military planners became more cautious, more concerned about protecting extended supply lines and defending conquered territories. The aggressive offensive spirit that had characterized Japanese strategy in the war's first months gradually gave way to a more defensive mindset. This shift did not happen overnight, but the seeds of doubt planted by Doolittle's bombers took root in Japanese military thinking. American strategy benefited enormously from the raid's success. Military planners gained confidence in carrier operations and unconventional thinking. The precedent of launching Army bombers from Navy carriers inspired numerous innovations in joint service operations. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign through the Pacific employed similar coordinated Army-Navy operations that would have been considered impossible before the Doolittle raid demonstrated what determined forces could accomplish. The raid also vindicated advocates of strategic bombing. While the debate between precision bombing and area bombing continued throughout the war, Doolittle's success in hitting specific military and industrial targets without deliberately attacking civilian populations supported the Army Air Force's doctrine of precision strikes. This approach would characterize much of America's later bombing campaign against Japan, at least until the final desperate months of the war. Intelligence operations benefited significantly from lessons learned during the raid. The mission highlighted critical gaps in Japanese radar coverage and defensive coordination. American planners exploited these weaknesses in subsequent operations. The raid also demonstrated that Japanese military communications security was inadequate, a discovery that would prove invaluable when American codebreakers achieved major successes against Japanese naval codes. The Doolittle raid ultimately succeeded not because of the bombs it dropped or the targets it destroyed, but because of what it represented. In the darkest hours of American military history, when victory seemed impossibly distant and defeat loomed with terrifying clarity, 80 volunteers proved that determination, innovation, and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. This message resonated through American society and military culture in ways that no number of destroyed factories could match. The raid embodied fundamental American characteristics that the Japanese military had dismissed or underestimated. Japanese planners had calculated American industrial capacity and found it formidable, but they believed Americans lacked the warrior spirit necessary to sustain a long, brutal war. Pearl Harbor was supposed to break American will, to convince the United States that Pacific dominance was not worth the cost in blood and treasure. The Doolittle raid announced emphatically that this calculation was catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, promoted to general after the raid, went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, finally the 8th Air Force in Europe, leading the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. He retired as a 4-star general in 1959, having become one of America's most decorated airmen. But he always considered the Tokyo raid his most important contribution to the war effort, not for the military damage it caused, but for the hope it restored to a nation that desperately needed it. The Chinese people, who suffered so terribly in the aftermath of the raid, demonstrated a profound truth about resistance and solidarity. Despite knowing that helping the American airmen would bring savage reprisals, village after village chose compassion over safety. This courage under impossible circumstances reveals something essential about human nature that transcends military strategy or political calculations. The estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians who died in Japanese retaliation attacks became martyrs to a cause that ultimately triumphed, though they never lived to see the victory their sacrifice helped secure. For Japan, the raid served as the first clear warning that their initial victories had only awakened American power, not defeated it. The bombs that fell on Tokyo announced that geographic distance provided no protection, that American industrial might would be mobilized and brought to bear, and that the question was not whether America would fight, but how long Japan could survive American determination. Japanese leaders who understood these implications, including some within the military and civilian government, began the long, difficult mental journey toward accepting eventual defeat, even as public propaganda insisted victory remained certain. The technical lessons from the raid influenced military aviation for decades. The idea of launching land-based aircraft from carriers, while not repeated in exactly the same form, inspired numerous innovations in naval aviation. The raid demonstrated that unconventional solutions to seemingly impossible problems could succeed if planners were willing to think creatively and take calculated risks. This philosophy would characterize much of American military innovation throughout the Cold War and beyond. In 2014, the final bottle of cognac was opened during a private ceremony as the last survivors grew too elderly to continue their reunions. The goblets belonging to the deceased raiders were inverted, a tradition signaling they would never again drink with their comrades. This ceremony, witnessed by a small group of family members and military officials, closed a chapter in American military history that began on that April morning in 1942, when the impossible became reality. The Doolittle raid remains a subject of study in military academies worldwide. Taught not primarily as a lesson in bombing tactics, but as a demonstration of leadership, innovation, and the strategic value of psychological warfare. Doolittle's decision to lead from the front, to be the first plane off the carrier, and the first over Tokyo, exemplifies the leadership principle that commanders must share the risks they ask their subordinates to accept. His crew's survival and success, despite facing impossible odds, demonstrates that thorough training, careful planning, and bold execution can overcome enormous disadvantages. For the American people, both then and now, the Doolittle raid represents something profound about national character. When attacked, America responds not with paralysis, but with creativity and determination. When faced with impossible odds, Americans find a way forward. When the situation seems darkest, hope emerges from courage and innovation. These themes resonated in 1942 as America mobilized for the greatest military effort in its history, and they continue to resonate today as symbols of what can be accomplished when a free people unite behind a just cause with determination, skill, and unwavering resolve to defend their values and protect their future.